Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar in this series on contemporary topics organized by the Center of Regulatory Excellence at the Duke-NUS Medical School in collaboration with L.E.K Consulting, Saracen, and the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. As you know, in Singapore today, or perhaps those of you from overseas may not be so familiar, a major series of restrictions linked to COVID-19 have been lifted with effect from today. And we've had a significant return to normalcy as of this morning in Singapore. And so it is useful and impactful for us to consider as we move out of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic to actually think of other broader issues that have been, in a sense, pushed on the back burner for the last 2 years, but are still very significant and important. And a key issue, I think, especially for those of us in countries with rapidly aging populations, is the whole issue of dementia. It's often been said that this is really a different sort of pandemic, not of an infectious disease, but of a major chronic disease that will engulf many nations. And there's been a lot of effort and initiative in terms of research, innovation, care development in sort of more developed countries. And this afternoon, we're going to specifically talk about the Singapore context. And we will be hearing from Mr. Fabio Lamola, who's a partner for global healthcare for the Asia Pacific for L.E.K Consulting, on a white paper and report that came out in January this year. And that will really discuss the dementia innovation and care framework in Singapore. And with that, we also have 3 very distinguished panelists joining us this afternoon, whom I will invite to share their comments after Fabio has made his presentation. Mr. Jason Fu, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Dementia Singapore, Dr. Charles Stacey, President and Chief Executive Officer of Saracen, and Mr. George Vredenberg, who's joining us from at a very early hour from the US East Coast. And George is founding chairman of the board of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. And they will each tell us a bit more about themselves a little later on. And I think without further ado, I would like to hand the time over to Fabio to make his presentation. And from that, we will then go into our discussion. And please feel free also, if you have questions or comments, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to key those in. And we will seek to address those during the panel discussion later. So Fabio, can I hand the time over to you, please? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for the introductory remark. And as John mentioned, we at L.E.K have supported and written a paper really on the value of dementia innovation, specifically for Singapore. But we have gathered input and collaborated with Duke-NUS, with Saracen, as well with DAC, that is represented by George here today, to really look across a number of different countries and what the current dementia frameworks were globally and how Singapore can learn from those. And we've distilled a few of the key points that we think are important for Singapore to take into account as we think about the dementia framework within our country. John mentioned the problem is quite substantial. The numbers are staggering. If you look at them, in 2020, 50 million people are suffering globally. In 2050, 30 years from now, that's going to be 3 times as high. The cost is as well quite substantial. You're looking at $2 trillion in 2030. It is a substantial problem, larger than cancer, although cancer gets a lot more headlines when we think about diseases. And so if you think about research, which is a topic that John mentioned, is one of the topics we're going to look into. There is 27,000 clinical trials in cancer. Only 10% of that is what is done in neurodegenerative diseases. We all know that research in central nervous system neurodegenerative diseases is a lot harder. Companies we're spending a lot more money, but the failure rates were a lot higher than any other therapeutic area. And in fact, a lot of companies have decided to exit R&D innovation in CNS because of the difficulty developing drugs. So the creation of a framework to actually reduce some of the numbers that we're seeing, to increase the number of publications and increase the number of research projects that are done on dementia is an urgent problem. And it's not only urgent for Singapore, of course, it's urgent globally. But the reality is that no single country alone will be able to tackle this, and a greater global collaboration is needed in order to actually make this happen. So one of the problems that is definitely worth highlighting, and again, that's why Singapore is an interesting place to start from in terms of thinking about research, is that there is an underrepresentation of Asian genomes being studied across the globe. Now, that also has clearly an impact on the research that's done in any field, but specifically in neurodegenerative diseases, as we were discussing before. Singapore is one of the few places where in Asia Pacific there is a concerted effort through CRIS and through PRECISE, which is the Singapore Precision Medicine Initiative, which is chaired by John actually, and which essentially collects the genome for the Singapore population, and potentially as one of the potential uses is also to stimulate greater research around dementia itself, but across a number of different diseases. So there is clearly potential for again for Singapore to increase the efforts around the research on dementia and to collaborate with other countries around this research effort. One important point is that dementia is not only research, and the reason why we have Jason Fu today with us is really actually to think about what other initiatives on the ground can be taken to alleviate the suffering of people with dementia, their care, their families, because it is a disease that unfortunately does take into involves a lot more people than just a sufferer. There are some examples of the actual cost to Singapore, and the number of people living with dementia is roughly 3 to 4% of the population at this point, and it is a significant cost for Singapore. It would be a significant cost for Singapore. We estimate about 3.7 billion Singapore dollars in 2020. That will grow almost double in 2030 to 6.5 billion. And most of it is really actually the care that gets given to sufferers in Singapore, and that is largely unpaid. Clearly, there is other cost to dementia, but the caring cost for these sufferers should not be underestimated. It is a significant proportion of the time that family and friends spend to support the sufferers. So what is currently Singapore doing for innovation within dementia care? And again, through innovation, we mean a number of different areas, not only research. So there is mental health and dementia services being set up across the nation. This clearly helps with diagnosing early, with intervening early, and to provide support for both the patients, but also the carers that will have to take care of these patients. Clearly, the setup of services, as I said before, improves the early diagnosis. It is something that the MOH has pushed significantly. There are outreach teams within Singapore that again support the potential patients that may be going through dementia and may be in the early stages, to help identify them and start caring for them early on. Clearly, the progression of the disease can often be slightly delayed through early intervention, and so that's a way of delaying reducing some of the cost that Singapore will incur. There is then a dementia care village that most of you have probably heard of that is being developed in Singapore. Again, that supports the quality of life of people living with dementia. And again, non-for-profit organizations that are supporting people living with dementia in Singapore, much like this. Essentially, they're here and now actions that Singapore is taking for dementia. There is research that is being undertaken in Singapore, Saracen and Dr. Charles Stacey being an example of that research being undertaken in Singapore for dementia. And clearly there is more that can be done in Singapore to support that research. So today we will explore again some actions that are being done here and now and that can be even further strengthened to support the sufferers, as well as to ensure that that cost that we've seen actually is contained for better research, for better medicines, for better intervention. So where do we see the key areas for actions in Singapore? So the focus on research, we have spoken significantly. We will see some of the initiative that DIC, DAC, and George have taken together with Singapore in terms of research. There is clearly further steps that can be taken in terms of integration of research platforms and other commitments that can be made in order to support, again, greater research within the Singapore environment. Policy communication and funding commitments are important. We'll probably hear a significant amount of that through Jason and the need for greater support for dementia sufferers. There is clearly a lot that the government is already doing for Singapore, specifically in terms of the support given to sufferers, but clearly there is a significant amount that is borne by the families of the sufferers. Care delivery and risk reduction, we mentioned a few of the initiatives already. Continuing to support those framework initiatives is important. And lastly, I think the engagement between local stakeholders and global regional partners. Again, we've stressed this throughout this discussion, which is the fact that it's not a problem that any country is going to solve alone. Global collaboration is needed in order to fund research, in order to perform clinical trials, in order to gather the necessary data and information around genomes, around behavior, around external factors that allow researchers to look into how to best delay, slow down progression, potentially, if taken early, avoid rapid degeneration of brain functions. So global partnerships and regional partnerships are necessary. We see the role of Singapore not only supporting these global partnerships, but potentially playing a premier role in the region, in Asia Pacific, to support the research and to become a center for excellence in terms of dementia research as well as dementia care delivery. So with that, I will pass it back to John and for the panel. We will focus, as I mentioned, on those two topics really around the collaboration in Singapore and the enhancement of the care frameworks and the enhancement of the research frameworks that already exist. John, back to you.
Thank you very much, Fabio, for that presentation. It very clearly and succinctly summarizes, I think, the key issues that were highlighted in the report. And if any of the audience have not read the report, I think the link was provided and we can also facilitate that if you need it. What I would now like to do is to ask each of the panelists, Jason, Charles, and George, in that order, to respond to what you've heard from Fabio. Tell us a bit more about yourself and your organization when you begin, and then just share your thoughts and comments. And perhaps with that, let me start with Jason and pass the time over to you, please.
Okay. Well, thanks, John. Well, I run a charity, or in Singapore, what we call a social service agency that supports people with dementia and their caregivers. So we have a whole suite of programs and services that support people living with dementia and their caregivers. As to Fabio's report, I would like to add that I think it's an important area that the Singapore needs to look at, which is research, because it's important that we find something that can help people with dementia going forward. But research is more long-term. It doesn't provide immediate help to caregivers and people living with dementia. I do understand as well that the Singapore government sometimes is not an easy decision for them. Where do you focus on? Do you focus on research or the immediate help that the families are wanting? And because I run the charity, I run this organization that we do groundwork, I can see that there's still a lot of gaps in Singapore that need help. And so, the charities and the organizations that are doing work in Singapore, they're all screaming for help as well. So I can understand what sometimes where the Ministry of Health or the government is torn, right? Whether we focused on research or not. Because on the ground, I mean, we're talking about support for people with dementia and the caregivers. There are still gaps. There's no one size fits all for all caregivers and persons with dementia. Depends on their stage of dementia, depends on the financial standing of the family, depends on the dynamics of the family. So we are constantly rolling out new programs, new initiatives to try to cater to all those needs, try to fill all those gaps. And there's different stages of dementia, like you have young onset, you have different needs, a person with early stage dementia, a person with severe stage, all kinds of different needs that there is available. So, and then we talk about stigma as well, which is still prevalent in Singapore. There's still a lot of stigma over dementia, and this stigma leads to isolation, loneliness for persons with dementia, fear of going out, fear of being in the community. Even for cases like diagnosis, I think Fabio mentioned about diagnosis, how the government is trying to get polyclinics to diagnose dementia, because there is still a long wait to get a diagnosis of dementia. If I'm not mistaken, it's something like 2 or 3 months to be able to get yourself diagnosed with dementia, and that's not really acceptable. So what can we do to speed up that process, and and all the different other support and care that is needed? But like I said, even though there's all these gaps, there's all these needs on the ground, I think I still agree that research is important. It's a long-term strategy that we need to do. I also agree with Fabio's report that the current research is based on the European profile, and there's lack of focus on Asian patients. So someone in Asia needs to pick that up and work on it. And I think Singapore is in a good position to start that. There's still a lot of work on the ground, but I think it's a good time to start thinking about it. And I think the government is seriously thinking about it. That's why I can see in the last couple of years, more grants have been provided for research. And also just last night, the Singapore government announced the opening of a dementia research center at the NTU L.E.K School of Medicine. And I think that's all great steps, taken to move into research and to give research a better focus and more funding. But like I said, at the end of the day, it's not an easy decision. So that's all I have to say, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Very valid points, and we will come back to those in the discussion later. Charles, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your thoughts on the report? I know you've contributed to it as well, but it'd be interesting for the audience to hear what you have to say at this point. So over to you, Charles.
Yeah, thank you, John. So by means of brief introduction to myself, my name is Charles Stacey. I'm the CEO of a neuroscience-focused biotechnology company called Saracen. The company's been, so by means of background to me, so I've been with the company for just over 5 years now. Prior to this, I was in the venture capital industry with a large European fund focused on investments within the CNS and neuroscience space, where I invested in a number of Alzheimer's related companies. I've also broadly been involved with the Alzheimer's community for a long time, and sat on the original stakeholder board for the Dementia Research Institute when it was set up in the UK in 2015, and was a co-founder of the Alzheimer's Association Business Consortium. So I've got an ongoing and broad engagement with the space. By means of introduction to Seracin, so Seracin, as I've mentioned, is a neuroscience-focused biotechnology company. We were founded in the early 2000s. Originally founded, our headquarters is in the United States, and our lead compound, tricaprolin, is in development for Alzheimer's disease, and we are currently moving into phase 3. Phase 3 is the final stage of development in drug development, and we are one of only a dozen or so companies with a drug in late stage development globally. We made the unusual step, which was to expand our headquarters in 2018 and establish a dual headquarters in Singapore. And we now have a team sitting in Singapore with regional sort of satellites from Singapore in Australia and Korea. And I'll explain to you why that is in a moment. So with regards to the report, I think this is a very important report, and I encourage all of those of you that haven't read it to do so. I think the existence of this report in itself is actually a testament to the fact that we are having the right conversation. This is, I think the overall message is that this is a critical time for dementia innovation, both on the drug development and the therapeutic side, but also in the care frameworks. And the existence of the report already puts Singapore ahead of other companies in having this dialogue and having this important discussion. With regards to some of the key messages that are highlighted in the reports, clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease are incredibly challenging. The failure rates, as is highlighted in the report, have been very high, one of the highest of any therapeutic indication. Prior to the approval of Aduhelm at mid last year, no drug had been approved in Alzheimer's disease for almost 20 years. Which is staggering given the scale of social, economic, and health burden associated with the disease. And even then, we know that the Aduhelm approval is still somewhat contentious within the community. And it is incredibly challenging, and they're incredibly expensive. To give you some idea, Seracin as a company has spent several $100 million getting to the stage at which we are, and we'll spend probably the same amount again before we get to approval. So they are challenging, which again emphasizes the need for us as an ecosystem, for governments and for all various stakeholders to get behind and support this incredibly challenging space, and to ensure that we're successful and to make it as efficient and streamlined as possible. And that's some of the themes we'll be discussing today. The other message to sort of highlight from the report is there are a number of different facets of the ecosystem which are picked up in the report. We talk about clinical trials, we talk about cohorts, we talk about innovation in general, and also around care innovation. And I think what's critical is that firstly, to establish that Singapore has very strong building blocks in which to build on. I think we're in a great position. That's exactly why we as a company chose to come here and set up Singapore as our joint global HQ. There are strong fundamentals around science. There's good access to capital. There is good a good workforce here and very engaged. And critically, within this dialogue of feeling we need, there is a lot of work to be done in dementia innovation. I think we're in good company, as is highlighted within the report. This is a problem not just experienced by Singapore, but a number of major nations around the world. A number of countries are taking steps to do that and have done so. But I think that Singapore has taken steps and is well positioned to take further steps. And ultimately, what's important is not just one particular element of the ecosystem, but actually all the facets of the ecosystem to be developed together. And they all hang together. When we're thinking about running our clinical trials, awareness of the general population, awareness of the healthcare systems, and driving those clinical trials, driving enrollments, having the support, infrastructures, having government engagement, which then drives non-dilutive funding as well as venture capital funding. These are all critical pieces, and the ecosystem has to grow together to support what we need to do over the course of the next decade or so.
Thanks very much, Charles. Now I'd like to ask George to give his views. And George, you've had a huge amount of experience internationally in this field. But I think we're particularly interested in also in hearing about the DAC, the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, which you chair. So what are your thoughts, both in terms of the report, what Fabio has shared, and perhaps also from a global perspective with a certain lens on Singapore and where you see us moving ahead? George?
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. My name is George Vredenberg. I chair the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. It is a partnership of the Global CEO Initiative on Alzheimer's. So that is basically the large pharma companies and many of the biotech companies in this space, collaborating with the World Economic Forum, the folks that actually host Davos. And so this was an effort that started in Davos and now has spread globally. The theory here is that we need a global mechanism to approach this disease. And the World Economic Forum had incubated large global mechanisms in Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccine and Immunization, as well as CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. So it had done this in 2 other spaces, which actually those mechanisms had proved major participants in the recent COVID effort. So the thought is that this is, as Fabio's presentation laid out, a global problem. It is associated with aging, although it is not itself a natural cause of aging and not a natural part of aging. It is a disease, but manifests itself and associated with aging populations. So as the world has aged, the prevalence of the disease is rapidly increasing. The challenge here has really been a problem of getting people to focus. The recognition that, as Fabio laid out, no one country can do this alone, but no one sector can do this alone. No one company can do this alone. So that in fact, one has to think much more comprehensively, much more collaboratively about how one attacks this disease. On the policy front, the United States did what Singapore is now doing. We did this back in 2012 and set a national goal of finding a disease-modifying therapy by 2025. The G8, then the G8 in 2013, committed itself as a globe to finding a disease-modifying mechanism by 2025. Now, so what was the strategy there? This disease starts 20 to 30 years before symptoms. So there is a very long period of pre-symptomatic disease into which, if you are capable of developing a disease-modifying therapy, one could introduce that into preclinical populations, pre-symptomatic populations, slow the disease down or stop it in a pre-symptomatic stage of the disease and never get symptomatic dementia. So we did this with HIV/AIDS. People continue today to be HIV positive, but can live a normal life without ever dying of AIDS. So the same strategy that was adopted for AIDS is now at least the strategy at a global level with respect to dementia. Find a disease-modifying agent, introduce it in preclinical populations, pre-symptomatic populations, slow the disease down, never get symptoms. So that's the strategy. The challenge here is that we don't know that much about the brain. The brain has been an understudied piece of our organ, and it's very complicated. There's many stars in the sky, that's how many neurons you have, and then there are 1,000 connections per neuron in your brain. So it is the most complex instrument probably in the universe. And introducing disease-modifying therapies into the brain presents both challenges on how to make sure that you are providing an efficacious result, an effective result, but at the same time a safe result. And so in the United States, we have raised our level of research investment from about 400 million when I started my US-based organization in 2012 to $3.5 billion a year, now being invested by our National Institutes of Health in identifying disease-modifying approaches. And then industry has probably invested multiples of that number and trying to take those basic discoveries, to the extent that we've been able to develop them, and turn them into drugs. And as Fabio's report has pointed out, the number of trials in Alzheimer's, the number of therapeutic agents in development in Alzheimer's is a fraction of what it is for cancer at a lower prevalence disease. So this is a challenge globally. The Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative has three strategies. One is to invest in research in cohorts around the world. As Fabio has pointed out in this important report, the low and middle income countries is the predominant location of most dementia cases in the world, but those countries have not been included in research. And so we are investing in cohorts around the world to identify and develop the tools and the data that those cohorts have developed or can develop in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia, so that we can identify the differential progress and source of this disease in differential populations. Most of the genomic research, as Fabio has pointed out, has been done in white Caucasians. Most of the people in the world and most of the people with dementia are not white Caucasians. So to understand the differential presentations of this disease in different genetic populations, we have to study all those populations. The second branch of this is clinical trials. So we have a clinical trial network in North America of 92 trial sites. We now have a European branch of that. It's not a branch, it's a European set of trial sites that work now in tandem, and we will have start the first transatlantic trial in the end of this year. But we need to begin to develop trial sites in the rest of the world because we need to test these medicines in the populations most effective. And the third branch of this effort is basically to begin to work with health systems around the world to be able to enable their primary care physicians to detect and diagnose this disease in that preclinical state so that we can introduce therapies when they come on the market into populations before symptoms occur so that we can slow this disease down and stop it before symptoms actually manifest. So that is the effort. We are 1 year into this, so it's still early, but we have raised significant amounts of money, 25 to 30 in our first year, largely from pharma companies. And we're now branching out and beginning to approach governments and major global foundations. The obvious ones are Gates and Wellcome Trust to help finance this effort. And then we will be able to invest in those cohorts around the world, link them through work with the Gates Foundation, link them so that every researcher in the world will have access to this massive scale of highly differentiated populations and be able to conduct the research. Just as the populations of the world are not white Caucasian, the research should not be white Caucasians, and the intellectual capacity of the world is not centered in white Caucasians. So we believe that if we give researchers from around the world access to the same very large scale, highly differentiated cohort of research assets, that in fact we'll be able to make faster progress against this disease. It's a tragic disease. My own family has 3 generations that have been lost to the disease, hence my personal interest, because I'm a lawyer and not an expert in this field, but I am passionate and committed, as are most of the people of my organization and the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative Organization, because of personal experience with this disease, which has affected so many people around the world. So thank you, John, for having me today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, George. Well, I mean, some responses to what you said. I think it's incredibly important that we have an initiative like the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. And of course, I must declare my interest because I'm involved in the leadership group. So I'm not a sort of neutral observer. You've drawn me in, and I'm very actively supporting it because I do believe quite strongly in the strategic perspective of it, and to position it at an international level, similar to what Gavi and Seppi have been doing to galvanize the support as Charles was saying, in a very difficult area. You've also said as well, I mean, the therapeutic innovations have been going on, but has yielded very little over decades. So it is, I think, very important to channel this. But could I ask you, also based on what Jason said earlier, in terms of the focus we have in Singapore at the moment on the care framework, and we've done a lot in that space in Singapore, and the ministry continues to push ahead with this. What is your view of Singapore's sort of role in everything you've described, the DAC as a whole, the three areas of collaboration you've described? What is your perspective on how Singapore can play a role and how DAC might interact with us?
Well, the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, as a technical matter, is a Swiss foundation. It has a US-based nonprofit, but there's no question that the large prevalence and growth in prevalence over the coming decades of this disease is going to be in Asia. And so there is great importance that we attach to finding sort of a hub, a regional leader in Asia who will participate not just on their own country, but basically serve as almost a guide or a driving force in the region. Tragically, China actually developed a drug and introduced it on market, and it's approved for use in China. They had a global clinical trial of that drug, and they just this week withdrew that drug from that clinical trial because of the impact of COVID. The COVID had diminished the capacity of clinical trial sites to bring participants in that trial into trial sites around the world. And as a consequence, their trial slowed. They were unable to continue that effort. So this is a major challenge. Obviously, it's a huge challenge for China, but it's a huge challenge for every one of the Asian countries. And the Asian population and the middle income populations, countries of the world are the center of future growth. So having a regional center of excellence that actually participates in all three of the research, innovation, clinical trials, and health system preparedness is critical to demonstrate the feasibility and the impact of putting together, as Charles has pointed out, sort of all elements of this ecosystem so that people prepare, not just develop the drugs, but actually have them able to go through a regulatory system that's trusted, actually recognizing that most of this is aging populations, that the government is going to have to support the initial reimbursement for these drugs, another high cost item for governments, and then actually have health systems that are prepared to detect and diagnose this disease very early in its progress. So slowing down the disease can actually prevent or defer symptomatic presentation. So having an Asian hub, having an Asian leader that innovates on research and on clinical trials and on health system and care practices is critically important to, I think, the success of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. So that's why we're intrigued by what you're doing in Singapore. That's why we participated with Fabio in this report. And I think it's an important report, as Charles and Jason have pointed out, and something that we very much hope to increase our degree of collaboration with Singapore in advancing this global initiative.
Thanks, George. I think the key word, of course, is collaboration, because as Jason alluded to at the beginning, if it's just focusing on what Singapore can offer in terms of our research funding, it would be a huge undertaking. But in a sense, I think once we're collaborating with and through the DAC and other sort of stakeholders, it does sort of spread, in some senses, the risk, but it also brings in a greater degree of resources and expertise, which should then enhance the likelihood of success in those three areas. Jason, I'm curious to hear from you, because you started the conversation, having heard what George has described and what Charles has said. What are your thoughts, about an initiative like the DAC and where you're coming from Dementia Singapore as you are dealing with real issues on the ground, in balancing the care framework against new research initiatives?
Well, John, I think after hearing what George had shared, I think I think the benefits are definitely quite astounding and quite significant for Singapore to be a hub in Asia. Like I did share before, I think due to the lack of focus on the Asian profile, I think we need to find somebody in Asia that's willing to take on this role. And I just feel that, yeah, I think Singapore is ready for it. And you're perfectly right that the collaborative um, angle of it really would be a lot more helpful, because it's a huge risk, it's a huge investment. For a small country like Singapore, it's a mammoth task actually to be an Asian hub. But if there are parties and partners worldwide and globally supporting this whole initiative, and we're just part of that whole framework and project, then I think it's doable. I just also wanted to share that about 10 years ago, when you go to caregivers of a person with dementia and ask them, would you want to participate in a clinical trial? It actually, the response that we got was actually quite negative, because they're so bogged down with the caregiving. They don't have time basically, to even think about, what's next to do, so participating in a clinical trial, just having to bring your person with dementia in your family to a place and get them tested or do a survey, it was quite difficult. But I would say that I must say that in the last couple of years, things seem to be changing. A lot more families are now more willing to participate in clinical trials, to get involved in research, to join research programs, to help basically, because they know that this is, at the end of the day, something that we need to have to benefit the future generations. Like what George said, dementia doesn't stop at one generation. If it's your dad or mom that has dementia, I think whatever trials that you participate in, whatever research you participate in, would be very useful in case one day you would need that help and support. So I think a lot more caregivers are more open to clinical trials, more open to joining, being part of a research program. So I think it's the right time, but there's still a lot of work to do. I think there is still a lot of investments that we need to think of what to do, and like I mentioned about the balance between immediate on the ground needs versus what is more long term and something that will benefit us in the next 10 20 years ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. I would invite the audience, if you do have any comments or questions to what you've heard, please feel free to put that into the Q&A. But Charles and Fabio, could I invite you to respond to the conversation so far, to add your further thoughts on what George and Jason have begun to talk about? Charles, perhaps, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's interesting because many of the drivers that George eloquently picked up on as being the needs of DAC when considering a regional hub within Asia and the importance on Asia, the parameters and the considerations are very much the same as those of Saracen when we were considering where to branch out from the US and set up our global headquarters in 2017. The fact that we chose here, I guess, is a good testament to the thought process that DAC is also having. And so for us, we are addressing Alzheimer's disease particularly, but other neurodegenerative disease as well. So being within the global center of the aging population in Asia is a critical driver. But very specifically, as Jordan alluded to as well, but from a slightly different angle, we saw all the fundamentals come together. And we considered a number of other countries, but we saw all the fundamentals come together in Singapore. A heterogeneous population, so the ability for us to look across a broad range of ethnicities and demographics there, and our lead compound is actually focused on a particular genetic phenotype, so that that was very important for us. We wanted a high quality leading healthcare system with the ability to run top quality studies with leading investigators around the world and highly recognized, and that obviously is the case in Singapore. The ability to do things efficiently. Clinical trials, as we alluded to earlier, incredibly expensive and take an awfully long time. So the ability to do things in an efficient, centralized way is something very unique to Singapore, and just the concentration, but the size of the country allows itself. But but also look, data quality and the fact that digital health records are ubiquitous within Singapore. These are all things that are incredibly important to companies like us. But also, look, we recognize the ecosystem in Singapore is still to be nascent, but we know that Singapore take a very long-term view to things, and when they put their mind to something, they can build themselves out as a regional hub. We see that happen in finance and shipping and others, and we think that's exactly the same thing can be done within biotech, innovation, and particularly within neurology, which we see as the big growth area within biotechnology. So, I think and we're now 4 years down the line, and we continue to grow our base here and continue to use this as a very successful hub for our access to Asia, but also around the world. So, I think it's a good testament that that DAC are considering Singapore for the right reasons.
Thanks, Charles. Fabio, your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I think very, very briefly on a point that has been mentioned a few times, but not quite elaborated on, which is the cost of actually bringing something to market around Alzheimer. When Charles said it's costed about 100 million and it cost us another 100 million to bring this to market, the key reason for this is because, as George mentioned, of course, the brain is probably the least understood organ within our physiology. But the other big point on this is a progressive disease. You can be 20 years without any symptoms. And then to actually get symptoms and to see the progression of symptoms, it takes years. It's not months, it's not days, unlike other diseases. And so you can't design a trial that only looks at a few months and get a drug out. It just doesn't work. So the cost of actually getting something to market for Alzheimer, for dementia in general, is significant. And so, there's a question from Danny, for example, on the impact of the growth of decentralized hybrid trials on recruitment of Alzheimer's studies. I think the more we can make trials efficient, decentralized, getting them to potentially mix real-world data that has already been collected together with whatever the drug mechanism of action and support for the dementia patient is showing, the better, because we can hopefully reduce that cost. We can hopefully get it to the point where we can observe the patient for 1 year instead of 2 or 3 or whatever the protocol becomes for that specific clinical trial. So the more we can get countries to participate in these type of initiatives, the more we can decentralize trials, but the more we can do them effectively for either hybrid systems, so the use of data, as we were saying before, the use of digital, but also the ability to collect consistent data across these decentralized trials, the better for getting these drugs to approval and to market. And I think, again, research, it's a multifaceted problem, right? You have pre-IND, so pre-drug approval, you have the clinical trial side, and then you have the actual approval of the drug. And just the cost across all these spaces for CNS specifically is staggering. So the more we can do to actually reduce those costs, the better. And that's why the initiatives like DAC actually that sort of look across the continuum of that problem in terms of the dementia disease are welcome, because they do allow multiple stakeholders to look at all these areas and say, how can we be more efficient in taking this to market, which before was difficult for a single company to affect.
If I could just pick up on a comment that Charles made and then Fabio just made as well, and a couple of questions in the chat. Digital technology has now moved to the point where we can actually make digital cognitive assessments of individuals and not go through what is currently the practice, which is paper and pencil MIMSI, mini mental status examinations, which takes an hour, which sit down and you fill out a variety of forms, and you have an individual that actually conducts that study to assess a person's cognitive status. Cell phones, now the most ubiquitous instrument in the world, can you do that very much on their own. Voice prints taken over time can detect deterioration in cognitive status as a result of your voice changing. There are now paper and pencil tests where you drew a clock and you could measure how long it took and what kind of error rate occurred. That can now be done on an iPad and on a cell phone. So digital technologies can now be utilized to assess cognitive status. So those kinds of innovations are remarkable. We began our digital cognitive assessments in Malaysia, of all places. And it turns out that, in fact, much of the Malaysian population does not have a written language. So the notion that you could conduct paper and pencil tests in Malaysia in significant parts of their population was you just couldn't do it. So in fact, we have begun using cell phones. The cell phone penetration in Malaysia is 200%. So we're beginning to use cell phones to do this cognitive assessment. So digital technology is a real innovation that is coming along and that in fact can now be used. To the same point, blood tests are now beginning to become capable of detecting this disease at a pathological or an underlying pathogenesis form of the disease. And you don't have to use big, highly inaccessible, highly expensive imaging equipment, which is the current status in the high resource countries. But if you're working in lower resource countries, you begin to use different technologies, different techniques. You're forced to do it because of the lower resource settings. So between advances in blood technology and advances in digital technology, innovation is our friend here and can be, for those countries who are just getting into the game seriously, they can use and leapfrog the high resource countries in how they approach these problems. And as one of the comments both of you have made is that distributed clinical trials where you do these digital tests from home. You don't have to go into a clinical trial setting or into a clinical setting to get your digital cognitive assessment done. And in fact, if depending on the capacity of the country, using phlebotomists or using other distant techniques for collecting the blood requires less and less actual trips to a clinic in order to get that data and those samples collected. So technology is our friend. New entrants into this field like Singapore can sort of leapfrog sort of the cumbersome, highly expensive and highly inaccessible techniques being used in higher resource countries. Well, we're not higher resource than you are, but in fact, if you think about Asia as a whole, there are a lot of low resource settings where these kinds of new technologies could be particularly useful to combine and get scale in the cohorts in which we do our research.
George, can I ask, this digital cognitive assessment that you're talking about, is it really equivalent to a diagnosis, or does that mean that once you go through a digital assessment or to detect symptoms, you think you might have dementia, you still would have to go to get to a clinic to get a proper diagnosis? I mean, what's the process here?
Well, at some point you'll probably need to see a physician of some sort, but a blood test now can tell us whether or not you would have gotten a PET scan, positive PET scan reading on the presence of the toxic proteins in your brain associated with Alzheimer's. So that in fact we can substitute a blood test. Now those blood tests can be done in the clinic, but those blood tests also can be in more rural or more decentralized settings. So you can actually get a detection of whether you have the proteins in your brain that are associated with this disease at a distance through blood tests. But there's no question that eventually you're probably going to have to see a physician, probably a neurologist. We're hopefully that we can drive down the detection and diagnostic process into primary care physicians, into pharmacies, into ophthalmologists, into a wide variety of care settings that are much more friendly to consumers. So we have now flagship sites in Brazil, Mexico, Jamaica, Scotland, Kobe, Japan, United States, to how to drive down the detection and diagnosis of this disease into primary care settings. We put out an RFP to others who wanted to participate and get some investment from us in partnership with us. And we found Brunei. We found a wide variety of countries around the world that in fact wanted to participate in how to understand how to do this at a primary care level or in other frontline locations like pharmacies. How do we do this at a pharmacy? So that you get a digital cognitive assessment, you give a blood test, and you can get a fairly rapid determination of whether you have any digital cognitive decline and whether or not you have the underlying biology of the disease.
Okay.
So innovation is our friend here.
Yeah, no, because the big question always is that after the assessment, and if you are considered either borderline positive or, you know, not very sure, what happens then, you know? And so that's always my biggest question that, you know, in my mind, because then you need to get you need to see a physician, as we said, you know, to get a proper diagnosis. And if that wait to see a physician is a couple of months, then this poor person is actually, you know, sitting at home thinking I might have dementia because the assessment tells me I have, but I can't really be sure until I get to see a physician. And so, you know, that's why I mentioned earlier in my sharing that I think an early diagnosis is important, and I think there must be enough facilities in the country to allow someone to be diagnosed fast enough so that, you know, after an assessment, if you need to get diagnosis, it's not like a couple of months, but maybe a couple of days. So you don't have to sit there worrying yourself sick whether you have dementia or not.
Spot on. Yep.
And Jason, maybe on that vein, right? There's a question around early screening in Singapore. What is the current practice in Singapore in terms of early screening? How is it done? You know, is it really something that can be extended, as George was suggesting, without the methods rather than PET scans and going to a physician to do a written test?
Yeah. So at the moment, in Singapore, the diagnosis is still by a physician or a doctor or a specialist. We don't encourage screening that much because, like I said, the worry is that because of the current wait time to get a diagnosis, a screening can open a whole floodgate of problems that people are worried, you know, because they are not sure whether they have dementia or not. There's nothing that they can do except to wait that couple of months before it's confirmed. So that's the worry we have about early screening. I am definitely supportive of early screening, early diagnosis, getting it detected as early as possible. But the question is, once you get detected or you have some symptoms, what happens after that? Yeah, that's the big question for us. Yeah.
And not just that, to build on that as well. I mean, not just the formal diagnosis, but ultimately, you know, there is a reluctance to have early screening because once you get a diagnosis, there's also a dearth of therapeutic agents, right? And then, you know, so there's this, you know, the common situation with Alzheimer's patients is, look, do I really want this diagnosis because there's so much I can do? And the answer is I think it comes back to my original point about, look, the ecosystem has to build out together. The early screening is a good thing if we can then provide the formal diagnosis and we can then provide the awareness and the education around dementia. Increasingly, there's a large body of evidence showing that there are lifestyle modifications we can make that can improve Alzheimer's disease. There are interventions we can make. You can get involved in clinical trials. And all these things, it takes an ecosystem to pick up on all these different things that need to grow together.
Well, we're reaching the sort of top of the hour. I was able to get back in after dropping out, but I just wanted to sort of wrap this up by, in a sense, addressing a bit of the elephant in the room. And Charles, you mentioned FDA's approval of Aduhelm last year, but it has had very different responses from Europe and even in Singapore. And I'm wondering to hear from you and George, how do you think this kind of issue would be addressed going forward as we're looking for new therapies? And even while we have something like the DAC, which is moving forward at a very sort of macro strategic level, there is still the issue of the sort of history of therapies and the lack of things that have come through in the past. How do we sort of turn around that perspective as we're thinking of innovation and supporting these areas? So perhaps Charles and then George, if you could sort of address these points.
Yeah, you're right. It has been hugely contentious, and for those, you know, it's the Aduhelm, when it was developed by Biogen, you know, the clinical trials that were conducted, they were positive, but, you know, maybe not to the you know, as originally intended, and therefore there was a debate around whether they demonstrated enough efficacy And ultimately, the FDA approved them with a view to then conducting another study post-marketing. And there's since been further controversy around, around the payment and reimbursement of these drugs. For us as a company, and I think as an innovation ecosystem, I think what we worry about most in stifling innovation is stasis and just a lack of movement, a lack of dialogue, be that by companies, drug developers, regulators. So, whilst it's disappointing that there is controversy around this, whilst we'd love to have a drug that had been widely accepted by the community and was unequivocally beneficial to patients and was reimbursed as such. Look, I think we have to look on the positive side here, and what we've seen here is companies still continuing to engage with regulators, regulators showing flexibility and willingness to change their framework when considering drug approvals and to take risks. I mean, the FDA has come under significant scrutiny for this. And I think you have to take your hat off and say, look, they're willing to take that risk. They knew very well that there was a risk there, but they still been willing to take it. And ultimately, look, we have to take some risks. I think the same applies to Singapore. When we're getting behind this indication, we have to think about taking some risks and backing companies. Some will fail. Some drug programs will not benefit, but that's okay. It's all part of developing and forwarding innovation. So generally, we take it as a positive. And look, we're seeing the repercussions of that since. We've seen Lilly, we've seen Eisai also file accelerated approvals for their lead compound since. And I think we're seeing the same thing across the board. So it's whilst it's a little disappointing, I think it's a step in the right direction.
Well, I totally agree with Charles and his analysis. It was not a regulatory issue in the United States. I mean, well, there was a regulatory issue, but our FDA found this drug to be safe and effective. But what happened is that our payer system in the United States, when you look at the number of people who might qualify for the use of this drug per the label that the FDA in the United States adopted, it was 1.5 million to 2 million people. And the drug was not inexpensive. It turned out to be about $28,000 a year. So if you really thought that there were 1 million or 2 million people who would take this drug at $28,000 a year, the payer system got very nervous about the expense to them. The payer system acted just like a commercial insurance company, and it basically rationed the care because of the expense that they were going to incur in reimbursing this drug, on top of the costs that they're incurring in taking care of people in the system who have this disease. So this is going to be a major problem going forward. Partly it's regulatory, but I think that this will be handled by regulators well. But it's the payer systems which are choking at the potential costs of both supporting the care costs of families with this disease, medical, nursing homes, et cetera, long-term care, as well as reimbursing for the drugs that are coming through the system before these drugs actually can reduce the cost. So there's going to be a bolus of costs to governments associated with care and reimbursement of these medicines until the medicines are sufficiently robust over time in which they can begin to reduce those care costs. And so this is a major roadblock, I think, that's going to occur in continuing drug development, and something we'll just have to pay attention to and solve.
Thank you, George. Well, I think we've exceeded the hour, but it's been a very useful and enlightening discussion. And I think for those who've not read the report, I think I would encourage you, as others have said, to have a look at it, because it frames what Singapore is doing, but sort of puts it at the cusp of moving into a sort of new phase, as it were, not in a sense giving up on what we've already begun to do in terms of care framework innovation, but also to keep an eye on the research aspects as well, because it is an interesting question and conundrum that with our aging population and with the likely higher rising numbers of people suffering dementia and Alzheimer's in the years to come, that there, especially when we're thinking of the healthier SG perspective now, which is really prevention, the investment in research to find new therapies that can actually deal with these much earlier in the course of the disease spectrum and development is obviously something we need to consider to balance this out going forward. So I would like to thank very much Fabio for his excellent summary and presentation of the report. And of course, our panelists, Jason, Charles, and George, for your great insights and also taking up the questions and sharing your perspectives. And I think we need to keep this conversation going, not just in terms of promoting Singapore as a hub, but because it is a very critical issue, not just for our population, but for populations around us in Southeast Asia and Asia. And we really do need to advance the thinking on these aspects of innovation in terms of research as well as care. So with that, please give us your feedback as it says on the screen here. But thank you very much for spending the time with us. And we look forward to follow up to this report and our engagements to advance this whole area, which is extremely important for our populations in Singapore, the region, and around the world. So with that, thank you very much. And we look forward to staying connected. Thank you so much and have a good day.